Peter. Thank you very much. As I'm not a lawyer, I will be using mostly a user perspective on doing biobank-based research in the legal framework that we have. There has been a large number of biobank-based studies also on a Nordic scale over the past 20 years. So I think I've encountered almost any possible legal problem that there is, but I will describe some of those that I think are the most important ones. And I can perhaps, before I start, just a short anecdote relating to the previous discussion here. And I was talking to the general director of the Datatillsynet in Sweden, and she said that, oh, everyone is complaining, but just think in our situation. There are at least 3 different laws on every issue. I would have preferred to interpret how to say that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit is one and the same. So it's not so easy, but I'll try to do my best. And I'm directing BBMRSC in Sweden, which is the equivalent of Biobank Norway. So first a little bit on what is the Nordic advantage in biobanking. Biobanking is very hot all over the world, but why is it so important in the Nordic countries? And that is because we have these comprehensive registries with data, heredity, socio-demographic factors, etc., where we can link the biobanks to those and follow up all the individuals without losing information, making it biased or so on. So this means that a biobank is just not storing data, but you need to be able to follow it up. Of course, you need to have samples and baseline data, but then you need to have follow-up, preferably for several decades. You can do that really only in situations where you can link them to comprehensive registries. It's not that you don't just need to collect the samples, it's about not having to wait for the outcomes. Instead of taking the samples and wait 20 years until the patient develops disease, you locate 20-year-old samples where you already know the outcome. This is the idea. Therefore, it's a unique Nordic advantage. And actually, I put this one in as this was a speaker this morning who was comparing the biobanks and the registries to the oil. And we don't have any oil in Sweden, but it's definitely comparable to fisheries and forests when it comes to the societal development on ensuring that we can really develop the biobanks and the registries. It's very important for society. So one thing that is because of this that we need to be able to follow the biobanks up with the registries, otherwise we don't have a competitive advantage. This means that we are a little bit different from the rest of Europe. We cannot use aggregated or anonymous data. Registry follow-up is based on identifiable data. We need to use the personal identifiers. And the samples to be picked up from the biobanks, they must be identifiable. We just can't go just out and pick out any samples. So, but once they are picked up, they are typically analyzed, coded, and all the omics data that we get from it are not linked to an identified subject. So under those circumstances, we think that the integrity threat is very limited indeed if it's just linked to the coded subject information. The most common complaints in the biobank research is that it's too many and too complicated rules. We can't make heads or tails out of it, and indeed it is rather complicated. And the other one is that it's unreasonable demands for consent. We have several examples where it's demanded to have individual informed consent in writing, also on cohorts where most of the subjects are already dead, or on studies that are based on 500,000 subjects who donated samples 30 years ago, where it's of course obvious that if they demand consent for that, it's the same as saying no to the study. Too many permissions required or too difficult to get is also a very common complaint from the scientists. So this is just that to specify that the follow-up is necessary for almost anything. When it comes to etiological research, the causal exposures were already some time before the disease occurred. In the clinical research, one is looking to treatment and the outcome if the patients became healthy or died. And in the prevention research, one also needs to know the future diagnosis in order to be able to put early diagnosis. All of these can only be done if you can link to the registries. So that's where we have a competitive advantage. Now, whenever we speak about the biobank and registry-based research, it's amazing that almost anyone we speak to, everyone is supportive. We speak to the patients, we speak to the politicians, we speak to the lawmakers, experts, and so on, and everyone is supportive. So why is it then so complicated? It's actually the most common problem is that politicians or lawmakers, they ask us to please be specific exactly what is the problem and exactly what is needed to make this really work. And this is just an example. This is from the Nordforsk. They published a review on the legislation in the Nordic countries last year. There are 54 pages of tables like this. I don't expect you to read it. Yeah, this is just chapter 10 on human biobanks, and you can see that it's a little bit different from each one of the Nordic countries, and if you read carefully you see that almost nothing seems the same. And indeed, if you go straight into the legal paragraphs, you may detect differences, but they're actually not so bad. But I'll tell you which ones are the ones that we have found to be the most disturbing ones. First one that came from our stakeholder dialogue. This is a project where we have been doing a series of interviews and workshops with decision makers in biomedical industry and healthcare, etc., to try to find out what do we really need and where do we think the problems are. And one very interesting example was the answer to the question that we see that the number of clinical trials that international pharma is putting in Sweden is going down. It used to be popular to put it in Sweden before, but no longer. What do you think are the reasons for this? And there was one international pharma company that produced a document with legal comparisons on what were the different settings to perform clinical trials in different countries. And there was one of them that resulted in recommendation, avoid trials in this country. And this was the possibility to store samples abroad. They thought that if we do a clinical trial, we need to store the samples, so who knows what we might need them for. And this was an international survey, and it turned out that this was forbidden only in 3 countries globally, which was Sweden, Norway, and the People's Republic of China. I hope there are not any citizens of Sweden, Norway, or the People's Republic of China in the audience. So now another project is the Nordic Biobank Network. It has already been mentioned by Christian Wem. It's a Nordforsk-funded collaborative network between national biobanking infrastructures in the Nordic countries that also includes Estonia. And what we said that we would like to do is that we would like to take from the biobanks and the registries and do one step further, because at present it's a little bit like raw material that can be used for research, but only after you have linked it. So we are offering this to the scientists. It's like offering the trees or the iron ore rather than the paper and the hammer to the scientists. So instead we would like to link the biobanks to the registries and provide, here are the samples, here is all the follow-up data, and here's for you to use. And then can we then combine all these magnificent registries we have in genealogy, demographics, patient data registries, and so on, and link it to the samples? It should be possible. Can we do it for real? Well, so we decided that we'll try to do that with one pilot disease, that was reasonably common, but not so extremely common that all the countries would already have done it by themselves, and we chose colon cancer. The idea was to do a very large-scale Nordic study providing information from registries and biobanks on the etiology and early diagnosis of this pilot disease. But it was also a major purpose to identify and report to Nordforsk on the bottlenecks that we encounter when we try to do this on a Nordic scale. Where were the legal and regulatory problems? First, we started in the ethical application. We wrote it very general, biomarkers and etiology of colorectal cancer, and some specific hypotheses like genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, etc., and applied for a waiving of consents. And the biobanks to use, we put a list of all biobanks that were listed at the government to ensure that it was just everything. And then we did a very important thing, and that is that we went to the LC Common Service Center of BBMRI SE, which is now also a European BBMRI ERIC LC service center that can provide services to scientists, and ask them to check the application, that it was ethical and in line with the legal framework in the Nordic countries. So this we did, and then we went ahead and obtained a permission for this study. So some bottlenecks on the ethical part. There was a problem that there is no clear legal basis for infrastructure. There is a clear legal basis for specific research, but not for infrastructure. So we were advised that if you do this as an infrastructure project, it will be we don't know anything. So then we decided to collect about a dozen specific research projects to add to it, so such that it would be at least being on a legal basis. But it took us about a year and a half to collect 10 specific projects to add to this one. And the other one was that many of the scientists that were part of this, they were not really used to asking for ethical and legal advice when preparing an ethical application. And in some instances, I thought that the attitude was almost defeatist, that they have said that, oh, but if we apply for something like that, they will just say no. And whenever I hear some complaint on that, the ethical review board, oh, they say no, I ask a copy for what did you really ask for, and usually I can understand why they said no. It's not really been well argued when they say no. So scientists should learn to take an ethical legal counsel before sending in an application. But because of this, we had to file first in Sweden, and when this was approved, the other countries filed similar ethical applications. It cost us about a year in delays. Well, of course, I think possible solutions is that the scientific community should learn how to use ethical legal advice when they apply for ethical permission, and then go for the project if the ethical legal advisor says that this is legal, then go for it. The other one that would also be very helpful would be a Nordic ethical review board. I can't see that the ethics is so very different between Sweden and Norway that a permission in one country shouldn't be possible to use also in another country. So when it was the registry linkages, we started then with the identifiers on everyone with colon cancer and the identifiers on mothers, fathers, siblings, and cousins, and then to calculate the hereditary risk of colon cancer, and to see if there were any samples saved from those with high hereditary risk. So the first thing was to ask from the PIN, from the government, the cancer registry. This was no problem. It took us a week before we had a CD with all the PINs in the mail. Then it was the relatives. We have a multi-generation registry at Statistics Sweden that tells all family trees back to 1932. But it was too much back and forth. Why do you need this, etc. And finally they said that, well, we might put you in the queue, but right now we have a 10 months waiting queue. So therefore we instead went to the tax office, but then we could link only one generation at a time, so it took us 3 big linkages to do this, but it was at least a little bit faster. Then we sent it for coded data for joint statistical analysis. In Denmark, very strongly increased risk if you had a relative with colon cancer, almost 400%. Some bottlenecks here. Norway failed to have a permission from Datatilsynet to send coded data abroad. We were asking them to send it to Denmark for joint statistical analysis of a Nordic study. This was not a problem for Sweden and Finland, but in Norway this was considered to not be allowed to send to this potentially hostile country. So, so then we had a little bit on that. The registries changed administration from one department to another, which caused some delays. And it was also high demands on a very specific protocol that also caused delays, because we had some professors of statistics that really couldn't agree exactly on what statistics we should use. So, but anyhow, we finally agreed and we could do this. So possible solution, we would be happy if we don't change the rules and regulations so often as they do. It takes time to find out how to do these things. And then the other one is that we're clearly annoyed that the Nordic countries are classified as abroad. I think it shouldn't be impossible to classify the Nordic countries by the same rules as inside the country. So when it was for example the requests, first we have at the biobanks, they put their content in a catalog, the BBMI register, and before the project started we checked with them to see that the samples were available and that they were adhering to the principle of open access, such that we could request the samples. So this should have produced some 30,000 samples from colon cancer patients if it had been true what it said in the catalog. But when we finally had the permissions and filed the real samples, it was not really the same thing. There is one case that I call the lip service open access. They never really meant to share samples with somebody else. So it said so in the homepage even, but they didn't mean to. First come, first serve with other projects filed since the pre-project contact with us. This happened in several instances. Well, there was no request on colon cancer when you first asked us, but since then we have several other requests, so now we can't hand you anything. Scared. This was just one of the biobanks where we couldn't understand what was wrong until we realized that we thought that these national biobanking infrastructure people, they are so high and mighty, we don't dare to give them any samples. And then some that were just not used to sharing. They had never had a request before, so they just had to find out how to do these things. So finally, 30,000 samples in the catalog, only a little bit more than 8,000 actually delivered. And I think this is the truth. The catalog and the real life world is not really the same. There happened some changes in technology during the time that this went on. It took us almost 3 years. We started with a list of candidate SNPs. In the end, we did full genome sequencing on a substantial part of the material. Some bottlenecks here, sending data abroad, and I mentioned before, the open access principle. I mean, to us, we thought that everyone adheres to it, but we don't talk to everyone, and it seems like we talk to other people who also believe in this. So, but when we go out there, we meet other people. There was not a widely recognized materials transfer agreement. I will come back to that. Possible solutions: don't change the rules and regulations so often. Are the Nordic countries really abroad? And then it's both that the journals as well as the funding agencies, they increasingly demand that data and research materials should be made available. And perhaps they should be demanding open access more actively to speed this up. And if we don't know how to share, we can help them in the national biobank infrastructures. I could mention that the material transfer agreement was a little bit of a problem. We have since about 15 years a single standardized MTA for Sweden, such that everyone recognizes this. But when we sent this to Finland, they had to send it for legal review, coming back about 6 months later with some request for changes and so on. And I think it would have been important. We actually were putting this as a deliverable for the BBMI LPC project to try to arrive at a joint MTA for Europe, such that it would be widely recognized and not need to have ethical review, legal review every time, because it's just the same. So, and I think my time starts to run out, and I think I skip this one, and I go straight to the summaries here, and that is that we found that the formalities are indeed quite laborious, but it's possible to do joint Nordic biobank-based research. Actually, permissions to do this on all biobanks in a country for very broad hypotheses is definitely possible and allowed already with the present ethical legal framework, which is an important message. We had issues within the scientific community that were actually much more important than we thought. And actually I commonly tell this to my fellow researchers, that you have a homework to do before you complain to others, to be genuine will to share data and to work in a more standardized, harmonious way, trying to make it simpler and easier for others. A limited number of changes in rules would be helpful. Being able to send data and samples within the Nordic countries would clearly be helpful. Perhaps a Nordic ethical review. But actually it was not so much that would be required to be changed to be quite efficient in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joachim, for sharing all the bottlenecks. I even noticed that the biostatisticians were bottlenecks in your project. Sometimes biostatisticians. You said that the statisticians were kind of a bottleneck too, because they couldn't agree on the modeling. Yeah. But as a statistician, I keep thinking that some of my colleagues, they have a nice time that either they make only theoretical models, or they simulate their own data, or they have these small data sets that have been shared among the statisticians for several decades. Much easier. Short question for Joachim. Christian?
Thank you, Joachim, and I think the take-home message for this very interesting project is not the scientific results, but how complicated it was to achieve them. And that is also a very important lesson. I think it's also the type of use cases that we want to have to argue towards these different governing bodies that are a bit troublesome when we want to have data. And since I'm responsible for the colorectal sample on the Norwegian side, I must then just underline that this was a problem from Statistics Norway, and it had to do.
I thought you said Datatilsynet, but I misremembered.
No, sorry. But I think the problem is probably related to the fact that Statistics Norway, they have some general rules that they cannot share these personal identifiable data with others outside the country.
I apologize.
And we need some sort of special rules for research project. So when Statistics Norway are going to handle both research projects and a lot of other projects, this is a type of bottlenecks that then frequently occur. I'm a bit surprised that you say that we cannot send samples abroad. We certainly do all the time. But if we want to store them for no further purpose unless, or except than just organizing a biobank in another country, that is a bit complicated. but shipping data out of the country, or shipping samples out of the country, that's what we do.
It's basically the same rule in both Sweden and Norway, and that is that we can send samples for analysis abroad, but we cannot store them abroad. And I'll give you a specific example on that this is indeed a problem, and that would be the biobank at the WHO IARC, where they have a huge project with some 20 countries, where most of the countries have the samples in the central international facility. But if you want to send the samples for joint analysis, there comes first, a big shipment with samples from all the other countries from the international repository, and then there comes a number of small parcels from Sweden and Norway also in addition. And well, as long as only 2 countries are outside of this, it still works. But what if every country would demand this? It would make it almost impossible to do international research.
Thank you.